Hello dear YouTube viewers, I hope you're doing well. Okays, let's start our video. The sun was warm, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood as Mark parked his car a short distance from his in-laws' home. The faint sound of laughter drifted through the air, mingled with upbeat music and the smoky aroma of grilled meat. He could almost picture the backyard, tables draped in bright tablecloths, plates piled with salads and snacks, kids darting between the grown-ups with sticky fingers and giggles. It was exactly the kind of gathering he thought would be perfect for reconnecting, both with his wife's family and with Emily herself. Mark was in his early 30s, a project manager who spent most of his days buried in deadlines and client calls. He rarely got the chance to slow down, but today he had left work early, a small victory in itself. The plan had been simple: show up as a surprise, enjoy some food, and feel part of the family again. For weeks, he'd sensed something quietly shifting between him and Emily. She'd been a little more reserved, her smiles less frequent, her attention wandering during conversations. He couldn't point to a single cause, but the growing gap between them felt real. Walking up the side path toward the backyard gate, he felt an odd mix of anticipation and nervousness. Maybe this barbecue would be the moment to close that gap, to remind her, and himself, of the easy connection they once had. He hadn't mentioned that he'd managed to get the afternoon off. Part of him liked the idea of seeing her surprised and happy to see him. He imagined her face lighting up, introducing him to relatives, the two of them sharing a plate of grilled vegetables while catching up on family gossip. That hope carried him forward, unaware of the sting that waited just beyond the fence. Mark pushed open the side gate slowly, careful not to let it creak, when a familiar voice floated toward him over the hum of conversation. Emily's laugh, light, almost playful, carried across the yard. She was standing with her sister near the drinks table, their heads tilted close, as if sharing a private joke. He paused mid-step, smiling instinctively at the sound, until her next words landed sharp and cold. "He's not even invited." The sentence hit like a sudden drop in temperature. There was a brief pause, followed by the muffled chuckles of the small group gathered nearby. Mark's stomach tightened, an uncomfortable knot forming beneath his ribs. For a moment, he stood frozen, trying to convince himself he'd misheard, that maybe they were talking about someone else, a distant cousin, a neighbor, anyone. But the tone in her voice wasn't one he could mistake. As he lingered there, half hidden by the fence, his mind began flipping through recent memories, like unwelcome photographs. Emily turning away mid-conversation when her phone buzzed. The way she'd sighed when he suggested joining her for dinner with her family last month. The quick, dismissive look when he mentioned wanting to spend more time together. The warmth he'd felt walking up the path began to drain away, replaced by a slow burn of confusion and hurt. If she really had been talking about him, then what did that say about where they stood now? Mark inhaled deeply, forcing the corners of his mouth upward into something that might pass for a smile. Pushing the gate open, he stepped into the yard as though nothing was wrong, the clink of glasses and bursts of laughter wrapping around him like an unwelcome blanket. "Hey everyone," he said, his voice even but a touch too bright. Emily's eyes found him instantly. For the briefest moment her expression faltered, eyes widening just enough to betray surprise, maybe even discomfort, before she smoothed it over with a practiced smile. "Oh, Mark, you're here," she said, the words polite but flat, as though he'd walked into a meeting unannounced. Her parents approached with slow, measured steps. "Mark," her father greeted, offering a brief handshake. Her mother's smile was thin, the kind people wear when they're being civil rather than warm. Around them, a few cousins glanced up from their plates, exchanging quick looks before returning to their conversations. The air felt heavier than it had moments ago, and Mark could almost hear the unspoken question lingering in their minds. Why is he here? Mark instinctively took a step back, pressing himself against the wooden fence, as if the thin boards could shield him from the words drifting over. He held his breath, straining to catch more of the conversation, part of him wishing he wouldn't. "It's better if he doesn't come," Emily's voice continued, casual but certain. "It'll be less awkward." The words landed like a slap, the meaning unmistakable this time. A flush of heat rose to his face, not from the afternoon sun, but from the sudden sting of betrayal. This was her family, his in-laws, people he had spent years trying to connect with. He had sat through long dinners, asked about their interests, even learned the names of distant relatives he'd never met, all in the hope of feeling like part of the circle. Now he stood on the other side of the fence, realizing he might have been on the outside all along. His pulse quickened, his mind split between two choices. He could push open the gate, plaster on a smile, and act as though he hadn't heard a thing, pretend for the sake of keeping the peace. Or he could walk in and confront her right there, in front of everyone, tearing the mask off whatever image they still had of their marriage. Both options tasted bitter. As he moved further into the yard, his eyes skimmed over each face, searching for a tell, a raised eyebrow, a smirk, anything that would confirm his suspicion. Did they all know? Had everyone been told he wasn't supposed to be here except him? The thought twisted in his chest, each polite greeting and forced smile, feeling like another layer of distance between him and the people who, at least on paper, were family. You said, ACT2, confrontation and backstory, approximate, 1,200 words, 5. Subtle conflict at the table, at the food table. Emily is polite but distant. Small talk with her brother reveals they didn't know he was coming. Annette makes a joke. Well, looks like we have a surprise guest. Mark smiles, but inside he's simmering, feeling like an outsider in his own marriage. ChatGPT said. Mark made his way toward the long folding table stacked with plates, bowls of salad, and trays of grilled chicken. Emily followed behind, close enough to appear attentive, but far enough that their shoulders didn't touch. She handed him a plate without looking him in the eye, her voice measured when she asked if he wanted potato salad. He answered with a quiet sure, trying to mask the undercurrent of frustration rising in him. Her brother, Ryan, strolled over with a beer in hand and a wide grin. Hey man, didn't know you were coming, he said, clapping Mark lightly on the back. The words were casual, friendly even, but Mark caught the slight tilt of Ryan's head, the way his brows lifted as if he were genuinely surprised. Yeah, Mark replied, forcing an easy tone. Managed to get out of work early. Thought I'd swing by. Before he could say more, one of Emily's aunts, a woman known for her blunt humor, passed by with a plate piled high. Well, look at that, she chuckled, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Looks like we've got ourselves a surprise guest. Her voice was playful, but the jab landed sharp. Several people smiled politely. A few avoided eye contact altogether. Mark responded with a practiced smile, nodding as though he were in on the joke. But inside, something churned. He could feel the edges of the day closing in on him, every small interaction reinforcing the quiet truth. He didn't belong here, not in the way he thought he did. This wasn't just awkward, it was alienating. He was starting to realize that the distance between him and Emily wasn't confined to their home. It extended here, into the very heart of her family, where he now stood as an outsider in his own marriage. Weeks earlier, the first hints of this rift had surfaced in ways Mark hadn't fully understood at the time. He remembered coming home late one Thursday evening, the smell of takeout filling the apartment instead of the usual faint scent of Emily's cooking. She'd been sitting at the kitchen counter, arms folded, her expression somewhere between disappointment and irritation. You missed dinner with my friends again, she'd said without looking up from her phone. Mark had tried to explain. Another late meeting, deadlines piling up, the usual chaos of his job, but the words had barely left his mouth before she shook her head. It's always work, Mark. You can't keep expecting me to make excuses for you. The conversation had fizzled into silence that night, but the tension lingered. Over the following weeks, it found new outlets. Emily began pointing out how rarely he joined her for family traditions. The Sunday brunches, the holiday baking days, the casual drop-ins at her parents' house. She insisted it wasn't about control, just about being part of the group. One evening, after another argument, she'd muttered something that stuck with him far longer than the fight itself. They just don't really get you. I don't know if they ever will. At the time, he'd brushed it off as frustration talking. But now, standing at this barbecue, those words echoed louder than ever. Maybe she hadn't been warning him. Maybe she'd been telling him the truth. Mark spotted Emily near the drinks cooler, chatting idly with one of her cousins. He waited until the conversation drifted to a natural pause, then stepped closer and touched her arm lightly. "Can we talk for a second?" he asked, keeping his voice low enough so no one else could hear. She hesitated but followed him a few steps away, the hum of voices and music dulling as they moved toward a quieter corner of the yard. "So," Mark began, watching her carefully, "I wasn't invited?" Emily's eyes flickered away almost immediately, landing on the row of soda cans lined up on the cooler. "It's not like that," she said, her tone even but laced with something he couldn't quite read. "Then what is it like?" he pressed, his voice firmer this time. She let out a short breath, as if the question itself was an inconvenience. "It was just a misunderstanding, Mark. You weren't supposed to take it personally. It just wasn't the right day for you to be here." The words hung between them, sharp and heavy. Somehow, this explanation felt worse than if she'd simply admitted she didn't want him there. Wasn't the right day. As if his presence were an inconvenience, a variable that could ruin the atmosphere. He nodded slowly, though inside something was twisting tighter, the space between them feeling more like a wall than a fence. Mark tried to lose himself in small talk with one of Emily's cousins, a guy about his age who was telling a story about a disastrous camping trip. He nodded along, even chuckled at the right moments, but his focus was frayed, drifting toward the low thrum of conversations around them. That's when Emily's sister strolled past, balancing a plate in one hand and a drink in the other. She flashed a grin and tossed the words over her shoulder. "Guess you didn't get the memo, huh?" A couple of people nearby snickered, and even the cousin he was talking to gave a short, awkward laugh. The joke might have been casual to them, but it landed hard. His chest tightened, the humiliation creeping up like a slow burn under his skin. Mark forced a smile, muttered something about needing to use the bathroom, and stepped away before anyone could see the heat rising in his face. He didn't head inside. Instead, he followed the side path until the noise of the party dulled behind him. Leaning against the cool siding of the house, he drew in a long breath, then another. The laughter from a few minutes ago replayed in his head, looping with Emily's earlier words. "Wasn't the right day for you to be here." The realization crept in, uninvited and undeniable. Maybe this wasn't just a bad afternoon. Maybe this was a symptom of something broken, something that had been quietly cracking for a long time. And maybe, just maybe, they had already crossed the line where it could be fixed. Mark closed his eyes for a moment, letting the muted sounds of the barbecue fade into the background, and his mind drifted back to when they first met. It had been at a friend's impromptu rooftop gathering, music playing from a single Bluetooth speaker, city lights shimmering around them. Emily had been leaning against the railing, hair catching the wind, laughing at something he couldn't hear from across the space. He'd worked up the nerve to introduce himself, and from the moment their conversation started, it had felt effortless. They'd stayed up until sunrise talking about everything from their favorite books to the places they wanted to see before they turned 30. Those early days had been full of impulsive road trips, late-night takeout, and the kind of passion that made promises feel unshakable. "We'll always have each other's backs," they'd said more than once, usually between kisses and whispered plans for the future. A few years later, when Mark was offered a major promotion that would have required them to move across the country, he turned it down without hesitation. Emily had been clear. She didn't want to leave her family, and the idea of raising a future child far from them felt wrong to her. So Mark stayed. He told himself that love was worth more than career advancement, that sacrifices were part of building a life together. Now, leaning against the side of the house, he felt the sting of doubt. Had she ever truly valued that choice? Or had it simply been expected? Just another thing he was supposed to give up without complaint? The thought left a sour taste, as if the memory of their love had been rewritten without his consent. Mark spotted Emily near the patio, standing with her parents, their expressions relaxed as they sipped from tall glasses. He walked toward them, each step steady, the noise of the party fading under the weight of what he was about to say. When he reached them, he didn't bother with small talk. His voice was calm but edged with steel. "If I'm not welcome here," he said, looking directly at Emily, "just say so." Her father's brows knit together, and he let out a short, awkward chuckle. "Now hold on, Mark. I'm sure there's been some kind of misunderstanding." But Mark's eyes never left Emily's. She didn't speak. She didn't rush to deny it, didn't offer any explanation that might soften the blow. She just stood there, her gaze shifting away toward the far side of the yard, as though avoiding the question entirely would make it disappear. The silence between them was louder than anything her father could have said. In that pause, Mark felt something settle deep in his chest, a realization he didn't want but couldn't ignore. Whether it was a conscious choice or one made long ago, Emily wasn't standing beside him. She was standing with them. And maybe, he thought, she always had been. Near the end of the afternoon, the call for a group photo went out. People began drifting toward the center of the yard, gathering in front of a row of blooming rose bushes. Mark followed Emily into the cluster, sliding in beside her with the faint hope that at least in this moment, they might look like a united front. But as he stepped closer, she shifted slightly to the side, just enough to leave a sliver of space between them. It was a small movement, subtle enough that most wouldn't notice, but to Mark, it felt like miles. Her cousin, camera in hand, scanned the group. "All right, everyone squeeze in," he called, then grinned and added, "Maybe just family for this one." The words landed with a dull thud in Mark's chest. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The air seemed to thicken with the awkward pause. Mark gave a small nod and stepped back, his face composed even as something deep inside him cracked. It wasn't just the comment, or the physical space Emily had put between them. It was the culmination of the entire day, the quiet confirmations that he was no longer part of her inner circle, if he ever truly had been. As the camera clicked and laughter followed, Mark stood on the edge of the gathering, feeling more like an onlooker than a husband. Something in him shifted then, not with rage, but with a cold, certain clarity. Whatever they once had was no longer here. Mark slipped away from the crowd, while the laughter from the photo lingered in the air. He moved through the open patio door into the quieter hum of the house, the muffled sounds of the barbecue fading behind him. His steps carried him down the hallway to the small guest room where they had planned to drop their bags earlier, though now, that seemed like a pointless detail from another life. The room was neat, the bed perfectly made, a faint scent of lavender hanging in the air. Mark sat on the edge for a moment, his hands resting on his knees, staring at the carpet, without really seeing it. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. For a long moment, he just held it, the worn leather warm from his touch. He flipped it open and slid his wedding ring off his finger. The metal felt strangely lighter than he expected, almost as if it had been waiting for this moment. Without ceremony, he set it down on the dresser, the faint clink sounding louder than it should have. Beside it stood a framed picture, him and Emily on their wedding day, frozen in a moment of shared laughter. She was looking up at him in the photo like he was the only person in the world. He wondered if she ever thought about that day anymore, or if it had become just another picture in a frame, something she passed without noticing. Mark's gaze lingered on the image for a moment longer, then he turned away. The ring and the memory stayed behind. Emily's footsteps were soft, but quick against the hard wood as she entered the guest room. She stopped in the doorway, her eyes flicking from the empty space on his hand to the ring resting on the dresser. "Mark, wait, can we talk about this later?" Her voice was careful, almost cautious, like she was testing the temperature of water she already knew was boiling. He slipped his car keys into his pocket and looked at her, not with anger, but with the kind of exhaustion that comes when the fight has already been lost. "No more later," he said, the words quiet but final. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but whatever she was going to say never made it out. Mark brushed past her, his movements deliberate, and walked toward the front door. He didn't slam it when he left. The soft click of it closing behind him was enough. The silence it left in its wake was louder than any argument they'd ever had. Mark slid behind the wheel, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb without a destination in mind. The streets blurred past in a mix of late afternoon light and shadows, his hand steady on the wheel even as his thoughts swirled. He thought about how love doesn't shatter all at once. It erodes, grain by grain, in moments so small you don't see them until the foundation is gone. A missed dinner here, a cold glance there, words left unsaid until silence takes their place. Today hadn't been the start of anything. It had been the proof of what was already over. Being uninvited wasn't just about a barbecue. It was about being slowly, quietly shut out of someone's life until you no longer fit in their picture, literally or otherwise. The drive took him past familiar streets, then into quieter neighborhoods. Without planning it, he found himself pulling into the small park where he and Emily had once shared a picnic early in their relationship. Back then, they'd sat on a blanket eating strawberries and laughing about how neither of them could figure out the corkscrew for the wine. He stepped out of the car, the cool breeze carrying the scent of grass and faint traces of flowers. Finding an empty bench, he sat down and let his hands rest loosely in his lap. The air was calm, but heavy in its own way. The kind of stillness that settles over you when you know you've crossed a threshold you can't step back from. This choice would change everything. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure if that was a loss or a beginning. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the park slipped into the muted blues and purples of early night. Street lamps flickered on in the distance, their light pooling faintly across the grass. Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket, once, twice, then again, but he didn't bother to check. Instead, he pulled it out, pressed the power button, and let the screen go dark. Somewhere faintly, he could still hear the muffled sounds of the barbecue. Laughter, the clink of glasses, the low hum of voices. It carried through the evening air like an echo from another life, one that no longer belonged to him. His wedding ring sat miles away on a dresser, small and cold, its absence on his finger feeling strangely natural now. If this were a scene in a film, the camera would pull back slowly, revealing him as a solitary figure on the park bench, the city lights beginning to blink awake around him. The empty space beside him said as much as his silence. Sometimes walking away is the only way to be seen, he thought, the words forming not with bitterness, but with a quiet clarity. And in that stillness he stayed. Thanks for watching. For more videos, please subscribe our channel.